mountains of Appalachia. There's a place so feared that maps once marked it with nothing but a warning: do not enter after dark. That place was known as Black Hollow, and at the heart of Black Hollow lived the Maddox family, a name whispered like a curse. The first time most outsiders hear about the Maddoxes is through a story that sounds too grotesque to be true. A mail carrier in the 1930s disappeared on his route through the ridge. His bag was found 3 days later, shredded and half buried beneath leaves. Inside were opened letters, smeared with what investigators swore was blood. But the more disturbing detail was the note found stuffed into the satchel, a childlike scrawl that simply read, "He's ours now." That's the kind of evidence that trickled out of Black Hollow for over a century. Not grand tales of war or empire, but scraps pieces of horror left like breadcrumbs for anyone brave enough to connect them. And every breadcrumb seemed to lead back to the same decaying family, the Maddox Line. When locals spoke of the Maddoxes, it wasn't with the casual cruelty often reserved for poor mountain folk. This wasn't a matter of mocking backwoods ignorance. No, the Maddoxes were spoken of with a peculiar kind of terror. One farmer put it best when he told a county investigator, "They don't live like us. They don't even die like us." It begins, as far as records can prove, with Elijah Maddox. He was a Civil War deserter who vanished into the mountains with a handful of followers and kin. When the war ended, Elijah didn't return. Instead, his line grew inside the hollow, insulated from law and morality. It's believed Elijah began enforcing marriages only within blood, brother to sister, cousin to cousin. The goal wasn't just control. Old journals recovered from the outskirts suggest Elijah believed their blood was holy, chosen. The Maddoxes were not hiding. In their minds they were cultivating something. That belief curdled across generations. By the time the 20th century began, the Maddoxes were already legends. Hunters swore they saw bonfires deep in the hollow, circles of figures dancing naked around flames. More than one claimed they heard babies crying out in the dark, though no infant was ever seen among the family. There were whispers of offerings, of a dark mouth in the mountain where sacrifices were left. When locals pressed for details, the stories always trailed off into silence, as if to even speak of it aloud risked summoning something. But here's the part that truly cements the Maddox legend: the survivors. Rare, fractured accounts from people who claim they escaped the hollow alive. One of the most infamous was a boy named Caleb, discovered half dead on the roadside in 1951. His body was scarred, ribs showing through his skin, fingernails broken as though he had clawed his way out of the earth itself. He never spoke coherently again, except for a single repeating phrase: "Don't let them take me back. Don't let them sing to me." Investigators who interviewed Caleb were unsettled by one detail. Whenever he muttered about the singing, his voice shifted higher, lilting, almost melodic, like he was mimicking what he'd heard. Old recordings exist in state archives, though they've been sealed for decades. Those who have listened describe it as a kind of lullaby, but warped, like children's voices played backwards. If this was just one story, it could be dismissed. But Caleb wasn't the only one. In the late 60s, 2 hikers went missing near Black Hollow. Weeks later, only one returned, a woman named Denise. Her clothes were torn, her hair matted with dirt, but she staggered into a ranger station, screaming about white-tied people in the caves. She said they dragged her companion underground. When asked how she escaped, she simply said, "They let me go. They wanted me to tell." And that's where the story shifts from myth to something much darker. Because Denise wasn't the last to claim the Maddoxes still walked those woods. Through the 80s and 90s, strange reports continued: gutted livestock left on porches, crude symbols carved into trees overnight, and in one chilling case, a church group that discovered a string of dolls handmade from bones and hair hung across a trail like a warning. Each fragment alone could be dismissed as mountain superstition, but together, they paint a picture of a family that refused to die, even when the world abandoned them. The Maddoxes didn't just vanish, they adapted, burrowing deeper, weaving themselves into the soil and the shadows. And here's the detail that still makes even hardened locals uneasy. On quiet nights, when the wind cuts just right through Black Hollow, some say you can hear it, the faint, lilting tune of children singing. Always just at the edge of hearing, always pulling you closer. Do you want me to continue into Chapter 2, another 10K characters, where I'll deepen this into what investigators and locals uncovered inside Black Hollow itself? You said colonies, ChatGPT said. Perfect. Let's roll into Chapter 2, 10,000 characters of the abandoned, inbred family of Appalachia, the untold secrets of the Maddox Line. This chapter shifts from scattered survivor stories to a more active investigation narrative, keeping a VD high with suspenseful discoveries, shocking imagery, and layered mystery. For decades, Black Hollow was treated as cursed ground, the kind of place hunters skirted and hikers deliberately avoided. But curiosity has a way of pulling at the human mind, especially when fear and folklore mingle. And that curiosity is what eventually drew lawmen, researchers, and even amateur explorers toward the remnants of the Maddox Line. What they found only deepened the horror. One of the first official attempts to breach Black Hollow came in 1974, when Sheriff Amos Redfield assembled a small team to investigate reports of missing livestock and strange fires seen glowing from the ridge. Redfield was no believer in ghost stories. He had grown up in those mountains, fought in Korea, and carried himself like a man who didn't rattle easily. But what he described after entering the hollow shook him in ways his deputies said he never recovered from. The search began at dusk, when Redfield's group followed a game trail deeper than most dared to go. At first, the woods seemed unremarkable quiet, still, almost too still. Then they noticed the trees. Every few yards a trunk was scarred with long vertical slashes, as though clawed by something with sharpened nails. The further they went, the fresher the markings became, until the bark still glistened with sap. Redfield's deputy swore he heard breathing in the dark, heavy and deliberate, keeping pace just beyond the flashlight's reach. When they reached what appeared to be the remains of an old settlement, they found cabins half-collapsed, roofs caved in under decades of rot. But inside those cabins was something no weather could explain. In one, the walls were covered in drawings, crude stick figures, painted in what looked like rust, but which tests later suggested was blood. In another, the floor had been dug out into a shallow pit filled with bones. Some animal, some human, none arranged randomly. They had been placed with intent, spiraling outward from the center like a grotesque mandala. It was at that point Redfield called off the search. He ordered his men out of the hollow, swearing they'd stumbled on nothing but old trash. But those close to him insisted. Something followed him out that night. Redfield retired within a year, began drinking heavily, and was often heard muttering to himself, "They were watching. They were waiting for us." That was the last official attempt to penetrate Black Hollow for decades. But where officials hesitated, outsiders rushed in. The 90s brought with it a wave of urban explorers, thrill-seekers with cameras who wanted proof of the Maddox legend. Most found nothing more than collapsing wood and eerie silence. But a handful returned, with footage that still circulates in dark corners of the internet. One tape, recorded in 1997, shows 3 men walking through the ruins of a cabin. Their flashlights sweep across walls, etched with dozens of handprints too small to be adult, but too distorted to belong to any healthy child. The camera jerks suddenly as one of them screams. When the light steadies, it lingers on a crude doll hanging from the ceiling, crafted from twigs and bound with strips of what looks disturbingly like skin. The men argue, panic rising, before the tape cuts abruptly. Only one of the explorers returned to town. When asked what happened, he refused to speak, only saying, "They didn't want us there. They let me go." The same chilling phrase Denise, the hiker, had used 3 decades earlier. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came in 2004, when a pair of spelunkers mapped a series of caves beneath Black Hollow. What they found remains sealed in police reports, but leaked accounts paint a nightmarish picture. Deep in the limestone caverns were chambers lined with soot, as though fires had burned there for generations. Symbols were carved into the stone spirals, interlocking eyes, jagged runes with no clear origin. And in the deepest chamber lay a pit filled with bones, blackened by fire, stacked almost neatly, as though placed there in offering. The spelunkers reported hearing voices in the dark, not echoing from the surface, but rising from deeper within the rock, too far to be explained. Voices chanting, singing, and threaded through it all, the sound of children laughing. They fled and never returned. But, to this day, both men refuse to camp outdoors, even in safe country. They say, once you've heard the Maddox song, silence itself becomes a predator. These fragments, lawmen who broke, explorers who vanished, caves that whispered formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. And the deeper one looks into the Maddox story, the harder it becomes to dismiss the possibility that they never truly disappeared. Some believe they adapted into something subterranean, surviving off what they could steal, emerging only when necessary. Others whisper something darker, that Elijah Maddox's obsession with blood and ritual had taken root, twisting his descendants not just in body, but in spirit. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: Black Hollow does not forget. Every few years, someone who wanders too close simply vanishes. Search parties turn up nothing but circles of stones, claw marks on trees, and those eerie bone-made dolls. And always, on nights when the fog drapes the ridge, there are reports of faint music drifting down the valley, a song with no words, a song that makes the hair rise on the back of the neck, a song that has no source, yet seems to call your name. And that leaves us with a chilling question. If the Maddox Line was abandoned, if their cabins burned, if their kingdom fell, then who is still singing? For over a century, the Maddox name lingered like a disease in the hills of Appalachia. Rumors of cannibalism, whispers of inbreeding, signs of rituals, they all pointed to a family that should have vanished long ago. But the deeper one digs, the more unsettling the evidence becomes. Because what if the Maddoxes didn't die out? What if abandonment was only a mask for something far worse? One of the most chilling pieces of testimony surfaced in 2011, when a pair of hunters from Kentucky claimed to stumble onto a figure deep in Black Hollow. At first, they thought it was another explorer, thin, dirty, moving awkwardly through the brush. But when their flashlight caught its face, they froze. The eyes were pure white, filmed over as though blind, yet it turned toward the light with absolute precision. Its mouth opened, and instead of words, a low, tuneless hum seeped out. The hunters fled, one firing a warning shot that barely steadied his nerves. Later, when questioned, both insisted it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't fully human. One of them swore he recognized the song. He had heard it as a child, when his grandmother warned him to stay away from Black Hollow. The pattern was undeniable. Survivors described singing. Explorers heard chanting. Hunters reported humming. Always voices, always in the dark. Could this be coincidence or the echo of something deliberately carried across generations? Researchers digging into forgotten county records uncovered something even more disturbing. In the late 1800s, a missionary documented his attempt to convert the Maddox Clan. His journal, discovered in a collapsed church cellar, described nights spent outside their compound, listening to choirs of voices rising in unholy harmony. He wrote that the voices came from beneath the earth, not the cabins, and that they seemed to rise in response to phases of the moon. His final entry read simply, "They do not sing to God, they sing to him beneath." The missionary was never seen again. This revelation sparked a terrifying theory. What if Elijah Maddox's obsession with purity wasn't just about bloodlines, but about worship? What if the Maddoxes had bound themselves to something older, something buried beneath Appalachia's endless ridges. Some suggest the caves of Black Hollow weren't just shelter, but temples. The bone pits weren't simply signs of madness, but offerings. And the children's songs weren't lullabies at all, they were invocations. The further one examines, the more terrifying the connections become. In 2016, geologists mapping fault lines near the hollow detected unexplained vibrations in the limestone beneath. Not seismic activity, not water, rhythmic pulses, as though something below was resonating. When the recordings were played back, some claimed the pulses resembled a pattern of beat, not unlike a drum. Others swore they heard undertones of voices threaded through the sound. The equipment was quietly removed, the findings buried. But if the Maddoxes did indeed tie themselves to something hidden in the earth, what became of them? That question was answered, at least partially, by an incident in 2019. A college student researching Appalachian folklore vanished while hiking near the hollow. Weeks later, his phone was recovered, miraculously intact despite exposure. On it were several videos. Most were normal trees, trails, notes about old stories. But the final clip is what haunts those who've seen it. It shows the student stumbling in near darkness, his voice ragged, whispering, "I hear them. I hear children singing." The camera swings wildly, catching glimpses of shadows moving between trees. Then it steadies on something impossible, several pale figures crouched low. Too thin, their limbs grotesquely long, faces obscured by tangled hair. They rock back and forth in unison, humming. As the camera zooms, one raises its head. The eyes are clouded, white as stone, and the mouth stretches into a grin far too wide. The humming stops. The figure whispers, directly into the microphone, "You shouldn't be here." The video ends. The phone was returned to the boy's family. His body was never found. And here lies the darkest untold secret of the Maddox Line. They were never merely abandoned. They adapted. They changed. Perhaps through inbreeding, perhaps through ritual, or perhaps through something far more sinister. They became something else. No longer fully human, no longer fully bound by flesh, but creatures of the hollow itself, pale as the limestone, blind yet all-seeing, carried by song that threads through the bones of the mountains. Those who live nearby still whisper warnings. They say on fog-heavy nights, if you linger too long near Black Hollow, you'll hear the sound of children at play. If you follow it, you'll never return. If you cover your ears, you might survive, but you'll still hear the song in your dreams. So the Maddox family was never truly abandoned. The land abandoned us. It pushed us back, warned us not to return, for inside those ridges, buried in shadows, the Maddoxes still sing, and they are always waiting for someone new to answer the call. And that, my friends, is the darkest truth of the Maddox bloodline. A family not erased by time, but transformed into something the mountains themselves chose to keep. Maybe they're still there, humming in the hollow, waiting for anyone foolish enough to wander too close. But now, I want to hear from you. Do you think the Maddoxes really survived in some inhuman form, or are the songs in the dark just echoes of fear? Drop your theories in the comments. I'll be reading every single one. And if you thought this story was chilling, wait until you see what's coming next. The next clan we're uncovering may be even worse. Their legacy didn't just haunt a single hollow. It spread like a curse across generations. Make sure you're subscribed with the bell on, because you do not want to miss it. Until then, remember this: some families die, some disappear. But in Appalachia, the worst ones never really leave.